Well, welcome back to another Through the Bible video. Today we are jumping into Exodus chapters 5 through 15. We are continuing the story of Moses, and we are entering now into a very common narrative, something taught frequently in Sunday school, the 10 plagues of Egypt. And if you remember in our last video, we asked a question: why would God harden Pharaoh's heart? And that's something that we're going to explore in our episode today. Moses and Aaron's request to Pharaoh is simple. God wants his people to be able to go out into the wilderness and worship him. They're going to hold a festival in God's honor. But Pharaoh says, "Who is this God that I should let you go? No, you belong here." They say, "We'll simply be gone for 3 days, but if you don't let us go, then God is going to send plagues on Egypt." But Pharaoh will not let them go and worship God. So Pharaoh punishes the people of Israel, taking away their supplies, but demanding that they still do just as much work. Pharaoh calls the people lazy, and in turn, the people turn on Moses, asking why he would stir the pot. And so Moses then goes back to God and asks God, "Why are you having me do this?" He's basically saying, "God, your plan didn't work. Pharaoh is not letting us go to worship." And what's interesting is that the Pharaoh is not actually named in these passages. We can do a little bit of digging to ascertain what Pharaoh may have been ruling over Egypt at this time, but the author of Exodus is intentionally diminishing Pharaoh's role in this story to elevate different characters. In chapter 6, we see God renew his promise with the people of Israel. He says, "Not only am I going to make sure that you can go out to the wilderness to worship me, but I'm going to make sure that Pharaoh drives you out of his land so that you can go into the land that I promised to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." He says, "I remember the covenant that I made with this people, and I'm going to uphold it." And here we check in with a mini census of where the people are at this time. And we can actually trace the lineage from the book of Genesis down to Moses and Aaron. Here they are in the tribe of Levi. God says that Moses is going to be like God to Pharaoh. Moses is going to represent God. And Aaron will be like a prophet for Moses. So not only is God equipping Moses with Aaron to be his speaker on his behalf, but God is also elevating Moses in his doubt. Why would God do this? If someone says that they don't believe in you, then why would you give them more control, more power? But really, it's like God is bringing Moses into his inner circle. He's saying, "I am going to allow you to speak on my behalf because I trust you, and I see that you can be more than this man who has fear and doubt and cowers and runs. You could be so much more for the people of Israel." You see, God sees the potential in Moses for what he's going to be and not just who he is now. And this is an opportunity for Moses to show God that he can be faithful and he can come through and he can see through these things even when the people are doubting him. And in verse 3, we see God say once again that he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart so that all of Egypt will see that he is God. Do these people need to suffer so that God's glory will be on display? Couldn't there be some other way that God's glory could be shown? When we talk about Egypt and the Egyptians in these passages, we're not talking about people on a personal level. We're talking about Egypt on a metaphorical level, because Egypt has taken the place of Babylon from the book of Genesis as the ruling predominant nation, and also a nation that is pushing people farther away from God. And so just like we saw with the Tower of Babel, where God dismantles a human creation in order for God's creation to flourish, God is going to break down Egypt on a symbolic level, because he's breaking down human kingdoms so that his kingdom can flourish. And we're going to see that when we get to the 10 plagues. God is actually going to remove his protection, and the world is going to fall into a state of decreation. everything is going to fall back into chaos without God's control. And we'll also see that the people are given many chances to turn away from Egypt, the kingdom or empire of man, and turn towards God. So when we look at these things that are about to happen, it's not about causing people to suffer. It's about undoing what a human empire consists of, which is simply silly structures built on top of what God has created and what God is really in control of. See, the empire is a distraction, and it might be a comfort or a point of pride. But God is going to show us that it is very small compared to his kingdom. So it's not about making people suffer. It's about making sure that God's glory is on display. However, that doesn't mean that Pharaoh's actions won't have consequences. When we look at the original language, this word of hardening Pharaoh's heart is kashah. And I think a really great way that we can think about this in English is this word obstinate. God is going to make sure that Pharaoh is obstinate. He is not going to budge on his perspective. And so it's not about God making Pharaoh do anything. It's more about enhancing what is already there. Pharaoh is already making things more difficult for the Israelites, and God hasn't hardened his heart yet. So you can almost think about it as God amplifying what is already in the character of Pharaoh's heart. So Aaron and Moses go to Pharaoh, and Aaron throws down his staff and it becomes a snake. And Pharaoh's magicians are able to replicate this miracle, but Aaron's snake staff devours the snake staffs of the magicians. But even witnessing this miracle and seeing that God is more powerful than this Egyptian magic, Pharaoh's heart is still hard. And it's important to note that God is not hardening Pharaoh's heart in this passage. It is just happening. He's becoming more obstinate on his own. So God sends his first plague, the plague of blood, and turns the entire water of the Nile River into blood. It's gross. In verse 19, it says that even their idols will be covered in blood. And again, this is the first act of decreation because water represents life. And so it's a two-pronged attack on the false gods of Egypt and also a taking away of God's sustaining life. But Pharaoh's magicians were able to replicate this same plague. So God then sends a plague of frogs, and the magicians were able to replicate this as well. But Pharaoh, becoming concerned, asks Moses and Aaron to pray to God to take the frogs away. And he even says, "If you do so, then I will let your people go and make sacrifices to your God." So Moses and Aaron prayed, and the frogs died off. But Pharaoh reneged on his deal. And see, we're seeing even specifically here that Pharaoh is hardening his own heart in response to what is happening. As soon as there was relief, Pharaoh went back to his old ways. So God next sends a plague of gnats, and the magicians aren't able to replicate this one. And of course, Pharaoh still does not let the people go to worship, and God sends a plague of flies. But this plague is a little bit different. God says he's going to protect a specific area where his people live. See, the magicians are beginning to realize that there's something special about this God that the Israelites worship. And now God is setting aside a place for his people. There's becoming this distinction, once again, between God's people and the people of Egypt that we've seen similar distinctions in previous passages. So Pharaoh tries to strike a bargain. He says, "You can sacrifice to your God here, just don't leave." And they go back and forth for a while, but ultimately, Pharaoh once again goes back on his deal with Moses. So God sends a plague on Egypt's livestock. And once again, he makes a distinction between the livestock of the Egyptians and the livestock of his people. And again, it's the removal of life from something that God had given life. So without God's influence, the lives of these animals could not be sustained. It's a decreation. It's a taking away of something that had been given, rather than a punishment or a striking down with anger and vengeance. It's showing what life is like without God's provision. And now that we're halfway through the 10 plagues, God sends a plague of boils. And the boils are so bad that the magicians cannot even stand by Pharaoh's side. And again, it covers all of the Egyptians, but says nothing about the people of Israel. And this is where we see that God now is hardening Pharaoh's heart. God is now amplifying. He's turning up the dial on Pharaoh's obstinance. Pharaoh had many chances to do anything to let the people simply go and worship their God. But now it's as if God is locking Pharaoh into his own course of action and saying, here are the consequences for the actions that you chose to take. And so things have now been set in motion that cannot be undone. God is going to make sure that Pharaoh sees exactly what it is like to go up against a true God, because the pharaohs of Egypt are seen as gods themselves. But a human God versus the God of Israel and the God of creation, God is going to make sure that Pharaoh sees exactly who he is dealing with. Not a God that seeks to bring pain and suffering and slavery like Pharaoh does. And now Pharaoh's world is going to be plunged into chaos. And so God, through Moses, gives this incredible monologue about exactly what Pharaoh's role is in all of this. That despite all of Pharaoh's evil and the abuse of the Israelite people, God is going to make sure that his glory is on display. And he sends this plague of hail and gives very specific instructions for the people to bring their livestock inside. And so now Pharaoh's magicians aren't even by his side anymore, and the people of Egypt, who are starting to realize what's going on, they are now listening to God's commands. But some still ignored God. And of course, they felt the consequences of this plague. And now Pharaoh's beginning to realize what's going on, and he's panicking. He's realizing that he's now locked into this course of action, and he's saying, I have sinned. But Moses calls him out on this. He says, I know that you're still not taking God seriously. But Moses calls off the plague, and Pharaoh and his officials, they harden their own hearts once again. So next, God sends a plague of locusts. And this passage specifically mentions the targeting of Pharaoh's officials. Because now that the magicians have left, and now that the people are beginning to turn, those closest to Pharaoh are starting to realize what's going on as well. They're saying, look around, what's left of our kingdom? What is the point of having them stay here anymore? So Pharaoh asked Moses and Aaron to take this plague away. And so a strong wind comes through, another important metaphor for God's creation. You see, whenever we see wind or the breath of God, it is God providing life. And so while the locusts brought death and destruction, God's breath, or this wind, cast them all out. But once again, God is locking Pharaoh into this course of action and slowly dismantling Egypt. And so God sends a plague of darkness, and only his people could see. Again, we should be reminded of God's acts of creation. The very first thing he does is say, let there be light, and he has taken away now even that. And this time, when Pharaoh says that he will not let the people go to worship, he also threatens Moses' life. And I think this is where Moses' perspective begins to change from being a coward to now being a leader for the people of Israel. And we see this in the culmination of the 10 plagues, the plague of the firstborn. You see, when Moses' story began, Pharaoh ordered the deaths of newly born male children. And Moses was delivered from that fate. It's this ironic idea of justice, that exactly what Pharaoh wanted to do to the Israelite people is now happening in his kingdom. But just like with the flies and with the hail, God is providing a way out. Something that Pharaoh did not provide, but God provided for Moses, God is now providing in this plague. He says that the firstborn of every household will die. However, if you put lamb's blood on your doorway, then my spirit will pass over those houses. And so chapter 12 gives us a picture of the first Passover and this festival of unleavened bread that's going to become a crucial part of the Israelite calendar, because they're going to be partaking in a meal that commemorates God's providence through this hardship. And ultimately, it will be that meal that Jesus takes with his disciples that we now practice today as communion. And it's important to note that God is speaking to a specific people at a specific time, because animal sacrifice is not commonplace today, but at that time it was. And so having this image of the lamb's blood seen as a sacrifice for these people so that their firstborn child will live, then becomes the image of Jesus being the lamb sacrificed on our behalf. And while that particular metaphor might not speak to us today, it would have spoke volumes to these people. And so finally this spoke to Pharaoh, and he said, go and worship your God. And the Egyptians even helped the Israelite people leave, because they didn't want any more destruction coming on their country. They finally had a perspective of who this God is that they're dealing with. So Moses leads the people out of Egypt, and he takes the bones of his ancestor Joseph with him. And God sends them a pillar of a cloud to guide them by day and a pillar of fire to guide them by night. But God wasn't done dealing with the corruption of Egypt. He once again hardens Pharaoh's hearts, and Pharaoh goes after the Israelites, pursuing them, wanting to bring them back. And so God tells Moses to stretch out his staff over the Sea of Reeds, also known as the Red Sea, but it's the same sea that Moses floated down in the basket in Exodus chapter 2. And God sends a strong wind once again and turns the sea into dry land. Once again, we should be reminded of Genesis 1. And the Israelites pass safely through, but the Egyptians are caught as God brings the water crashing back down around them, which once again should be a reminder of the story of Noah and all the people who refused to acknowledge who God was and instead decided to follow Pharaoh. They faced the same consequence that Pharaoh did, which was ultimately death. And so in chapter 15, we see Moses and Miriam singing these songs of what God has done for the people of Israel. And then God provides water for them in the wilderness and reminds them that what happened to the Egyptians will not happen to them, because he is a God that wants to provide and not to kill. And this is where the people of Israel begin their journey through the wilderness. And that's where we'll pick up in our next episode.